My name is Yitzchak Etshalom, and I'm honored to be part of this marathon of light to chase away a lot of darkness that we really have in all parts of the Jewish world. And I'm honored also to be teaching from Malon Shvut right now, where I've come to visit, as Shoshana said so beautifully at the end of her presentation, to come to visit, to give chizuk, but also to get chizuk. And the topic that I'd like to look at is something that directly impacts on our understanding of this week's parasha, the story of Yaakov and his wives and his children. And it is the challenge of unity in Yaakov's household, Achdut b'veit Yaakov, which is a challenge that, of course, we face and something that I think we are all cognizant of has been issues that have been brewing within our world over the last few years, and that seem to be, at least temporarily, put away and put aside, hopefully for us to all work together for the common good. But I'd like to take a look at this in a more, shall we say, antiseptic way, looking at the way that the Torah deals with this problem and we see in our history. And I'd like to start with two quotes, not from our parsha, but rather from the perhaps most well-known text that we have as Jews, which is Haggadah Shel Pesach. Just one note, plug for the Haggadah is there are probably more commentaries on the Haggadah than any other book that we have. The shelf of Haggadot in a good library is maybe 2 shelves or 3 shelves, and anybody who's anybody has written a commentary on the Haggadah because of the centrality of the experience of the Seder. And in the Haggadah, we read the following paragraph, which is the way we present it is 2 paragraphs, but it really is one. And I'm using here the Nusach of the Rambam, and I'll explain why in a second. Baruch Shomer Avtachato Yisrael Baruch Hu, Shakadosh Baruch Hu Mechashev et HaKetz. Most of us have the Nusach in our Haggadot, Shakadosh Baruch Hu Chishev et HaKetz, and it turns this entire story about something that happened once in the past, and we regard it as being about Yetziat Mitzrayim. But the Nusach of the Rambam and many other Rishonim is Mechashev et HaKetz, which makes it about an ongoing reality that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always calculating the end. La'asot k'mo shamar la'Avraham Avinu bein ha'betarim. I'm going to be using the Mechashev approach in order to address this. In order for Hashem to fulfill that which he promised Avraham at the Brit Ben HaBetarim in Bereshit Tetvav, Shenemar, and we then quote the first 2 of the 4 psukim of the Brit. ויאמר לאברהם ידוע תדע כי גר יהיה זרעך בארץ לא להם ועבדום וראיינו אותם 400 שנה וגם את הגוי אשר יבואו דן אנוכי ואחרי כן יצאו ברכוש גדול. Now the oomph of that statement is, Avram, you should know that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land. They'll be enslaved, they'll be oppressed for a very long time. And the nation that oppresses them or that enslaves them will I, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, judge, and they will leave with great wealth. And we read this entire piece as being about Yetziat Mitzrayim, although, as again, the Nusach Mechashev et HaKetz means that it's part of an ongoing cycle of Jewish history. And this is followed up with the line that comments on that Brit, Ki she'amda la'avotenu v'lanu. That Brit is what stood for our ancestors and for us. Again, it is an ongoing cycle. As we see today, that there are people who stand over us and try to destroy us, totally obliterate us. HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzilenu biyadam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu saves us. Now, the traditional or the conventional understanding about what the referent of he is, Hisha Amdal Avotenu, is that God will eventually judge the nation that oppresses us, and we will leave with great wealth, and that as we endured, so we will prosper, and we will be redeemed and be saved. We will later on visit another approach of this, of understanding what the he is. But I want to then move to a more direct line in the Haggadah, which begins the real core of Magid. It introduces it, and it is the famous midrash of Arami Oved Avi, which is introduced with the following line. Seilmad, which is a rabbinic idiom for to investigate. Ma bikesh Lavan ha'arami la'asot liYaakov Avinu. What was it that Lavan wanted to do to Yaakov? Paro only wanted to kill the males, meaning in the original decrees of infanticide, it was about killing the boys and not the girls. Lavan wanted to uproot everything. Now, where do we find that Lavan wanted to uproot everything? In the famous standoff that takes place at the end of this week's parasha on Har HaGilad, when Lavan faces off against Yaakov and says to him, I could have hurt you, but your God appeared to me last night and told me that I can't speak ill or even good to you. And then they fight, they negotiate, but Lavan doesn't do anything to Yaakov. Well, what was it that Lavan was threatening to do to Yaakov? At the most, it was to hurt Yaakov, maybe to kill Yaakov, but to do something to his own children and his own grandchildren, the opposite. That's exactly what the tone of his complaint is. These are my children, these are my grandchildren. You took them away from me, we should have had a farewell party, etc. To think that Lavan's intent was to wipe out his entire family, his progeny, at that point is kind of strange. So I'd like to make a different suggestion about what Lavan bikesh la'akor et hakol might mean. In order to understand that, we have to take a look at the events that take place at the core of this week's parasha, which is Yaakov's marrying Leah and then Rachel, and we want to see a little bit of background with that. Now, there's a particular challenge that comes up because of Yaakov marrying two sisters, which is if you take the approach, which is an agadic approach suggested in the Mishnah at the end of Kiddushin, and it is an approach taken by several Rishonim, which is that the Avot were careful to observe all the laws of the Torah even before it was given, either as Eino Mitzuvevo says, a voluntary act, or in some other form. There is a problem because marrying two sisters is a very clear and serious prohibition of the Torah, as you see in source 3. You may not take a woman and her sister. And then there's a unique word used here to describe what that relationship would be like, litzror, to create enmity. And as Rashbam explains, what does litzror mean? Referring to Pnina and Chana as sarot, right? Which is shtei nashim leish echad nikrut sarot zo lazo. Two women married to the same man are enemies. That's the way it is. And then the Bechor Shor in his commentary here talks about the grievousness of the prohibition of Isha Elachotah, because he says Davar Kashehu in source 5. Shtei achayot she'ein ahuvot zo lazo. Two sisters who otherwise love each other. And you bring the second one into your household, and now they're going to be enemies because naturally two co-wives are enemies. And now you take your sisters who otherwise loved each other and you turn them into enemies. They fight with each other, etc. And he points out why the prohibition exists. Even if you divorce one, you can't marry the other one. And he goes into the details of that. So this awful situation, and then Yaakov Avinu is marrying two sisters, which leads Ramban to his famous comment, which is that the Avot kept the Torah uncommandedly, but only in Eretz Yisrael, which is why he said Rachel had to die. Rachel, being the second of the sisters to marry, had to die when they entered the land. There's a lot of difficulties with that Ramban, but that's his approach because he's again taking this. Now, those who are not bothered by the notion that the Avot kept the Torah, except those things which they were commanded, like Shav Mitzvot and Milah, and perhaps Gidan Hashem, would then not be bothered by this issue. And we're going to see yet another comment, another approach to trying to sort of justify this relationship. But the point that the Bechor Shor makes is very powerful, is that inherently having two wives is going to create enmity. And creating enmity when there's already all of the psychological baggage that any siblings carry is just horrendous. And you see that the first point in a famous parasha in Parshat Ki Tetzei, right after the introductory Fatoar, the next parasha is exactly a parasha about a man who's married to two wives. It says, Ki tiena li'ish shtei nashim, in source 6, ha'achat ahuva v'ha'achat senua. So a man is married to two wives, and one is, literal translation, is beloved and one is hated. Now, it's very hard for us to to tolerate that as a translation. Because why is a man married to a woman that he hates? So we could make the argument that this is a mefutar or an anusa or somebody who was forced to marry and he can never divorce her and he's stuck with her, perhaps. But we find in many places in the Torah that the word, and including in our parasha, that the word ohev and soneh, or ahuv and sanu, beloved and, as we'd say, hated, whenever it is in a multiple relationship, meaning one and another, ohev et zeh v'soneh et zeh, it really isn't best translated as love and hate, but rather prefer and prefer less, or love and love less. And some of the Rishonim say that immediately about Leah. And you see that, for instance, in the introduction to the wives of Yaakov and Esav, when we hear about the relationship of their parents to them. Ve'yahav Yitzchak et Esav b'fiv Rivka ohevet et Yaakov really must be translated as Yitzchak favored Esav and Rivka favored Yaakov. We don't find any reason to say that one of them didn't have love for the other child, but they had more love for one. They had a preference for one. So here we'd best read it as a man has two wives. One of them is more beloved and one of them is less beloved. And let's just, for the heck of it, give them some names. Just to make this easier, we'll say that there's a man whose name is Jay, and he's married to two women, one whose name is, let's say, Rocky, who he likes a lot, and one he likes a little bit less, whose name is, let's say, Lee. All right. And both Rocky and Lee birth him children. And it turns out that Lee has the older child. We'll call him Ruby. All right. And in the meantime, Rocky, who he loves more, has a child later on who we'll call Jojo. I'm just making up names out of the air. When it comes time for him to give his estate over, which essentially when he dies, he's not allowed to favor the child of the beloved one, who is not the Bechor, over the child of the less beloved one, who is the Bechor. In other words, he can't give the Bechorah to Jojo, he has to give it to Ruby. And this is the deen of Pishnayim, of a double portion of the inheritance. The law of the Bechorah belongs to the one who is really the firstborn child, even though his mother is less beloved. Now this, of course, seems to be, and you could tell by the names that I was using, seems to be directly responding to the story of Yaakov himself. Yaakov has two wives who are described as Ahuva and Snua, and they both give him sons. And the son of the Snua is Reuven, and the son of the Ahuva is Yosef. And take a look how Divrei Hamim, by Sheni period, justifies Yaakov giving the Bechorah to Yosef in seeming violation of this law. Uvnei Reuven Bechor Yisrael ki hu Bechor. Divrei Hamim Aleph, Perakei, Pasuk Aleph, in describing, in presenting the genealogy of all of the tribes, in introducing Reuven is introduced as follows. He's the Bechor, no question. Ki hu Bechor. But when he violated his father's bed, in other words, the incident with Bilhah, the Bechorah was taken away from him and given to the children of Yosef. Not to say that they really are the Bechorah, are the Bechor, Yosef, but rather the rights of Bechorah were given to him, which leaves the Sforno to make the following comment using this pasuk. That is, this is the Sforno's comment on our parsha in Dvarim. Lo yuchal avakeret ben ha'oval pnei v'nasnu ha'bechor. Meaning, lo yavir ha'bechorah min haben bishvil sinat zu or havat zu. He cannot transfer the Bechorah because he favors one wife over the other. Aval im yaseh zeh b'sibat bishat ben ha'bechor. But if, on the other hand, he transfers it not because of his love for one mother over the other, but he transfers it because of the bad behavior of the child himself, then it's appropriate to switch it. Ramzal, and this he quotes the Gemara in the 8th parak of Bava Batra, which is, if the Bechor, who is the child of the less favored wife, is behaving badly, then the father should make that transfer. And Adrabah, the father is praised for doing that. And now Sforno brings it around to, that's what Yaakov did. And he quotes the pasuk in Divrei Hayamim. In other words, Sforno is bothered by this problem, which is you're not allowed to favor the child of the beloved wife if he's not really the Bechor and give him the rights of the Bechor or the financial status of the Bechor. Unless, based on what we see here in Divrei Hayamim, the child himself, the Bechor himself, behaves badly and isn't an appropriate heir to that status, then it should be transferred, and Yaakov indeed did the right thing to hand it over to Yosef. Looking at all of this, though, we see brewing in the relationship that Yaakov had with his wives, just all of the recipe for disunity, all of the recipe for jealousy and, dare I say, hatred. And we see it bubble up to the top, of course, and we're going to take a look at that. But I want to contrast that with something that happens a generation earlier, and actually 2 generations earlier. Off of our text, we have Avraham. Avraham is monogamous. Avraham marries Sarai, and we already hear in the end of Noach, there's Sarai Akarai in Lavalad. Sarai doesn't have any children. Hashem tells Avram, you go to the land I'll show you, and I'm going to make you a great nation. And Avram takes Sarai with him, and at no point does Avram seem to even suggest, certainly does not act on, taking a second wife or divorcing Sarai and having a wife in order to fulfill that great destiny of having a great nation. Instead, he is loyal to Sarai. And the only time that we know of, and the only reason to think that there are any other times that Avraham tries to have children with anyone else, is at Sarah's insistence. And notice how the text in Bereshit Tet Zayin presents it. Vayishma Avram l'kol Sarai. Avram obeys Sarai and does exactly what she asks, takes Hagar, impregnates her, and as soon as Hagar acts the way she does and Sarai gets angry, Avram hands her back. Avram is supremely loyal to Sarai. We then turn to Yitzchak, and here's Yitzchak, who is Bizaracha. He is the one who's going to carry on that great bracha of a great nation and of inheriting the land. And he marries one girl, Rivka. And for the next 20 years, they have no kids. And Yitzchak davens, Yitzchak prays, Yitzchak does whatever he can, and finally they have 2 kids. We don't hear Yitzchak taking another wife. We don't hear Yitzchak trying to increase his chances. Because as you can see, monogamy really is the ideal, even though polygamy is technically permitted, and there's also socioeconomic reasons for it, etc., and political reasons. Nonetheless, that seems to be the model. Both Avraham, and only after the death of Sarai does he marry Keturah. And even that, unclear if it's actually marriage or Pilegesh, unclear in the text. And here we have Yaakov. And by the way, before we get to Yaakov, notice what the text says about Esav. And this is part of what perhaps gives us a bad feeling about Esav already early on in the text, which is Esav right away when he marries 2 women. It's not even as if Esav marries a woman and he's unable to have kids with her, but he's loyal to her, so he has a second wife. He marries 2 women. The fact that they're both Chitiot may be significant, maybe not, but the text tells us the following. Vahi Esav ben Aron Shana in source 10. Vayikach Ishat Yehudit bat Beiri Achiti ved Basmat bat Elon Achiti, 2 Chiti women. Vatiana Morat Ruach liYitzchak u'Rivka. They were a source of bitterness to Yitzchak and Rivka. Why were they a source of bitterness? The text doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us that because they're Chitiot, doesn't tell us that they're Obdeot, Avodah Zarah, both of which are suggestions raised by the Midrashim. The simplest read of it is, why did Esav take 2 wives? And what becomes further complicated is that when Esav sees at the end of last week's parasha that his parents are unhappy with his wives, instead of divorcing them, seemingly, he takes a 3rd wife, which is Machalat bat Ishmael, because Esav evidently interprets his parents' disfavor as being, well, you don't have anyone from the family. They're all from these Canaanim. So go take somebody from Abraham's family, so it's Machalat bat Ishmael, your first cousin. Okay. But that doesn't seem to be the direction that you're supposed to go in. And if you recall, just before that pasuk, what did Yitzchak tell Yaakov to do? Go to Lavan and take one of his daughters as a wife. That's what Yaakov is off to do. Parenthetically, just because I want to close the circle on Esav, if you take a look at the end of Parshat Vayishlach, and you see the genealogy of Esav, his wives, his children, Elufei, Esav, etc., you see something curious happen. And that is that Esav has 3 wives, as we saw in Toledot, but they don't have the same names. We have, instead of Basmat Batelon, it's Ada Batelon. And instead of Machalat Bat Yishmael, it's suddenly Basmat Bat Yishmael. And then there's a 3rd woman in there who comes out of nowhere, seemingly, Olivama Vatana Bat Sivon Achivi, who is evidently part of his attempt to assimilate into the Seir population, which he ultimately conquers. So Esav, how many wives does he really have? According to the Ramban, he actually had 6. According to others, he had 5. Some say he had 4. And then Rashi says it's the same 3 and the names got switched. There's different approaches to understanding that. But it's almost as if you could see, here's Esav, who we already see as rejected. Esav is already the one who's not going to be the one to continue. Esav doesn't know that. Yitzchak doesn't know that for a while, but we know that. We know that already from the moment of Rivka's Nevuah, Shnei Goyim Vitnech, V'Rav Yavod Sair. And we see Esav's wives. On the other hand, what do we expect of Yaakov? So now let's take a look at the story in the middle of this week's parsha. We'll slow it down a little bit and take a look, because this story is troubling. On the other hand, parshanut-wise, it's just delightful and is a text to analyze. So the setup is that Yaakov, of course, is sent away by his father to go to Haran to find a wife. Rivka's purpose in getting him to Haran is, at least partially, to escape the anger of Esav. And he comes to Haran, and he meets some fellows by the well, and he has a conversation with them, and he sees Rachel, and he gets very excited about it. And Rachel comes and tells her father who's here, and Lavan brings him into the house, and father said, and Lavan says to him, "You're my family. You'll stay here." So he works for him for 30 days, and then Lavan says, "Listen, I can't ask you to work here for free. What do you want as payment?" And here we go. Lavan shtei vanot. We're going to look at this in depth. This week's parsha. Lavan shtei vanot. Lavan has 2 daughters. Now, by the way, which daughter did Yaakov already meet? He met Rachel. He met her a month ago. And Rachel is evidently a young girl, and she's out shepherding what seems to be a very small flock. One young girl shepherding a flock, it's probably a small group. Shem hagadola Leah v'shem hakatana Rachel. And immediately we're wondering, well, if he doesn't have enough money to hire shepherds, maybe he has a very small flock, why is the younger girl out there shepherding the flock? We're going to find out in a minute. Ve'enei Leah rakot. Leah has soft eyes. Now, we all grew up with Rashi and Katzarich Liot, and we all grew up with Rashi saying that Leah had washed out eyes. She was unattractive. She was always crying because she was upset, because everybody was saying she'll marry Esav, etc. But most of the Rishonim go in the opposite direction. They take the approach that Rachel had, Leah had very soft eyes, very pretty eyes. She was what we might call a girly girl. And indeed, that's the reason that she was not sent out to be the shepherdess, because she really couldn't be outside too much. Rachel is presented here a little bit more as a tomboy. Rachel hayta ifat Torah v'ifat maret. And now watch what happens. Vayahav Yaakov et Rachel. Now again, Vayahav here, it's a little bit hard to say he's in love with this girl. What does he know about her? It seems like he prefers Rachel. Remember, what was he sent to do? He was sent to marry a wife. And so he sees these 2 girls and he prefers Rachel. Vayomer, what does he say to Lavan? Evodcha sheva shanim b'Rachel bitcha haketana. So he says, I'll work for you for 7 years for Rachel. Now, why would he say 7 years? The simplest explanation would be that Rachel was actually very young and was approximately 7 years away from marriageable age. Nobody got married, not betrothed, but married in the ancient world before around the onset of puberty. So she was a young girl, and he favored Rachel. And he says, okay, I'll work for 7 years, and then it'll be time for her to get married. Of course, assuming that by that time, her older sister Leah would be married. And as we know, that doesn't happen. So what does Lavan say? Lavan, Tov titi ota lach mititi ota the ish acher shvai madi. He begrudgingly sort of agrees to it. Now, is this a strategy where really he's happy about it, but doesn't want to appear happy, or is he really not so happy with it? In any case, Yaakov goes to work for him, and Rachel is the promised girl. And by the way, we have no idea how much interaction or contact Yaakov had with anyone in the household over these next 7 years. We know from ancient herding contracts that herding, just like we remember from old cowboy movies, herding was something that took months, and sometimes people were gone from their house for months at a time, herding. So it wasn't as if Yaakov was living in the house the whole time. So we don't know how much contact he had, which will play a role in what we deal with later. So what happens? Vayavod Yaakov Rachel sheva shanim. So Yaakov works for Rachel for 7 years. And this is a very difficult pasuk to read straight up, because we all know that when you're anticipating something, longing for something, it seems as if it stretches forever. Think about watching the clock on the last day of school in June and watching the minutes tick off. It seems to take forever, right? As opposed to the clock on the first day of school in September, speeding up to get there. But nonetheless, the text says it was as if it was just a few days, because he was so enamored with her and with Rachel and anticipating getting married to her. Okay. And now, Vayom Yaakov Lavan hava et ishti ki malu yamai. So Yaakov comes to Lavan after the 7 years and says, let me have my wife. My days have done, meaning I've completed my servitude, as it were. And I wanted to come to her. This doesn't have to be read only euphemistically as relations. It could mean just to come and join her in the house. In any case, Vayasof Lavan, and this is where things get really testy. Vayasof Lavan had called Anshe Makom Vayas Mishter. So Lavan gathers everybody from the town and makes a party. Why? Because that's what you do when somebody gets married. You make a party. Now, there's several things that we have to picture here. And again, an important rule in narrative is when you're reading a narrative, you have to be inside the story in order to see what's happening and fully appreciate the nuances of the text. So it's now evening, and Lavan takes Leah and brings her to Yaakov, and Yaakov has relations with her, which means where was Leah during the wedding feast, which taking place in the afternoon or in the evening before nighttime, before she comes in. So we have to assume here that there's a separate party for the women, or Leah's in some room getting prepared or something, and Rachel's with her, evidently, or not part of the party. The party is mainly only for men. And so Yaakov has no idea who this is going to be. As we know, he will expect it to be Rachel. And at night, when it's dark and there's no lights, and perhaps, as Chazal say, out of a measure of tzniut, or just pragmatically, they didn't have any lights in the room, so this girl is brought in. And perhaps, as some say, she had a veil on or something, and therefore he couldn't really see her face. And it's Leah, and Yaakov lies with her. Some of the Rishonim point out, Shor, for instance, points out this shows Yaakov's tzniut. He didn't engage in chatter with her because then otherwise he would have recognized from her voice that she is Leah and not Rachel. Perhaps, on the other hand, maybe he hasn't really heard either of their voices for the last 7 years so much, and maybe he wouldn't recognize it. And a girl's voice certainly changes from the time that she's a young girl until she's of marriageable age. So we don't know. In any case, Yaakov has relations with Leah in the dark. And somehow, at this point in the text, Zilpah, which is Leah's personal handmaid, is handed over from Lavan and now given to the possession of and the ownership, the control of Leah. And here we go. Vahiva Boker. What happens in the morning? Vihinehi Leah. Vihine in Tanakh is a surprise. Behold, it's Leah. He opens his eyes and it's Leah. Now notice, Yaakov, just like Sarah in her time, when Sarah was angered by Hagar, she didn't say anything to Hagar. She said she got angry at Abraham. When Yaakov is angry because this is Leah, he doesn't get angry at Leah. He gets angry at Lavan. And so what happens? Vahiva boker b'nei Leah, vayomer el Lavan, mazot asita li. What'd you do? Halo v'Rachel avadti mach v'lama rimitani. Now, here's why I want to stop for a moment. What Yaakov says is, I worked for Rachel. Why did you trick me? Now, question number one is there really deceit here? Question two is, if there's deceit, who's in on the deceit? Now, we're all familiar with the famous midrash that when Yaakov and Rachel first met, Yaakov said, I want to marry you. And Rachel said yes, but father's tricky. And Yaakov gave Rachel a secret sign or some sort of code. And that Rachel, before the wedding, said, "Oh, Leah, my sister, is going to be mortally embarrassed when Yaakov asks for the code. She has no idea what he's talking about. And therefore, I'm going to give up my opportunity here by giving the simanim to Rachel." There's a few versions of that story, but that's the kind of the nut of it. To give it to Leah so that when Yaakov is with her alone, she'll be able to say the code word. He'll think it's me, etc. Question is, how does that conversation go on? What's Rachel's motivation? And all the nuschot is, I don't want my sister to be embarrassed. So how do we picture that conversation going? Is that a conversation where Rachel says to Leah, listen, I happen to know that men from Canaan, when they have their first relationship, this is what they say? Not likely. So the only way we kind of picture this is for Rachel to come to Leah and say, listen, he's really expecting me. And we have a little code. I'm going to tell you the code so you don't get embarrassed. But isn't that itself very embarrassing? And we're going to see later on in the text that position really can't be upheld in the text. So we have the following question. How many people were involved and aware of this quote-unquote deception? And I say quote-unquote deception because it may not be the case. But let's think about it. We know for sure that Lavan had to be aware that it was Leah coming in and that Yaakov expected Rachel. We know that Yaakov didn't know about it. So really the question is, what about Leah and Rachel? Did they know about it? So the truth is, there's good reason to think that neither one of them knew about it. Rachel did not know that Yaakov had bargained for her trough. He did not know that Yaakov, she did not know that. We don't ever hear that them in the same context where Yaakov says to Lavan, I'll work for 7 years for Rachel. And so here we are, and take a look at the way that Lavan responds. Vayomer Lavan, lo ya'aseh bin komenu. We don't do things like that here. Notice that when Yaakov accuses Lavan of remiyah, of deception, Lavan doesn't respond to the deception claim. He blows it off by saying, you're in the wrong place. We don't do things like that here. To let the younger girl get married before the older girl. And by the way, if you think about it, there's a little bit of musar in there, saying we don't do things like that in our place. Maybe where you're from, you pretend to be your older brother and you steal brachot and you disguise. We play it straight here. The older comes first. And therefore, there's no way in the world that I could marry Rachel off before Leah. What, 7 years ago, you said? Who knows? 7 years ago, Leah would still be single or whatever. And so the question is really, is this a deception? Or is this Yaakov not paying attention to what's going on around him, being aware that she has an older sister, and not thinking, well, there's an older sister who's not married. How's that going to look? And it's very possible that Rachel was not aware of this, and Leah was not aware of this. And Leah was just told, here's Yaakov's been working for 7 years. You are the promised bride. You go marry him. And Rachel doesn't know that she's been pushed out of the way, or nor has she contributed to it. Let's see how that plays out. But either way, what we have now is Yaakov married to the sister that he doesn't want, staying on the property, and there's the sister that he does want right nearby. So Lavan anticipates that, and immediately says, Malei shvuazot, give this one her week, meaning the tradition of having a 7-day celebration for a marriage is something that is ancient. And we see that it was practiced here. So Leah gets her week. Give her week of celebration. And then you can marry the other one. And notice he says, Zot. This one and that one doesn't even use their names. Not nice on Lavan's part. For the work that you do for me for another 7 years. Now, from Lavan's perspective on the spot, what's happening? Lavan is essentially taking advantage of Yaakov's weakness. Yaakov really wants Rachel. Yaakov is a great worker, and as Lavan will say later on, Yaakov being in Lavan's household has increased his portfolio greatly. If Lavan can get another 7 free years out of Yaakov, meaning he doesn't have to pay him anything, and 7 years of work, that's going to be wonderful for him. So whether or not he deliberately planned this with getting Leah and knowing that Yaakov would stick around for another 7 years for Rachel, or seeing Yaakov's reaction, he on the spot comes up with this, he has made a good deal. By the way, that should not be too foreign to us, because you think about the way that Yaakov took advantage of Esav's hunger in getting the Bechorah from him. Now, before you yell at me, which we're muted so you can't, but think about this. There's a famous midrash. I'll show it to you it's a famous midrash in Breshit Rabbah about when Yaakov wakes up in the morning and sees it's Leah. So in the text, the first conversation he has is with Lavan, but in the midrash he has a conversation with Leah, and he's angry at her, and he says to her, Midrash Rabbah on the spot says, "You deceitful girl, daughter of deceitful father. The whole night I was cooing Rachel, Rachel, and you were saying yes, yes." And she essentially turns to him and says, "Big shot." And the whole time your father was saying Esav, Esav, and you were saying yes. It's a very powerful statement that Chazal constantly see within the book of Bereshit, Midah Keneged Midah. And what you put out there comes back to you. And perhaps that's also what happens when Yaakov took advantage of Esav's hunger, and now Lavan is taking advantage of Yaakov's desire and getting another 7 years from it. But in any case, what happens as a result? We now have two sisters married to the same guy. Remember what we said about that at the beginning of the shiur. And what that is a recipe for is a destruction in the family, terrible destruction. And we see it almost come to that later on. We'll take a look at that. We'll take a look at that quickly. And watch how even on an emotional level, at the beginning of this complex relationship, things bubble over. And so, Vayas Yaakov came, Pasuk Chavchet, Vayimalei Shvuazot, he gives Leah her week, and then Vayiten Lo Rachel Bito Lisha, and then he marries Rachel, Vayiten Lavan Rachel Bito Bilha Shivchato La Shivcha, and Bilha comes along, and here we go, Vayavo Gam El Rachel, so he also has relations with Rachel, Vayahav Gam El Rachel Leah, but he prefers Rachel to Leah. And it wasn't just at the beginning when there were two young girls. Now that he's married to both, he prefers Rachel to Leah. By the way, that's inevitable. There's no way a man's going to be married to two women and have exactly 50% of his attention and his love, everything divided between them. He's going to prefer one over the other. And then he works for another 7 years to pay off Rachel. Now, what happens? And again, that word. God sees that Leah is not preferred. And what does he do to give her a leg up? He opens her womb. Rachel Akara. Meantime, Rachel doesn't have kids. Now, parenthetically, in order to take a little bit of the sting out of this Rachel Leah thing and Yaakov marrying them, the Bechor Shor, whose approach in several places is the Avot kept the Torah exactly. In the story when the three visitors come to Avram's tent, Avram serves them chemah v'chalav uven bakar. Bechor Shor says in that order because, of course, you could not give him chalav after bakar, because Avram kept the mitzvot. And in the same way, the Bechor Shor here says something that will complicate our situation even more. He says that Rachel and Leah had to be from two different wives. Lavan had two wives. Rachel is the daughter of one, Leah is the daughter of the other. And he says the reason is because in the rules of Bnei Noach, paternal sisters are not a prohibition. Paternal siblings could even marry each other. And therefore, that's why Yaakov was allowed to marry them. Now, this is a complex issue, which is, well, if he kept the Torah, shouldn't the standards of what defines siblinghood be maintained from later? That's a complex issue, which we don't have time to engage in. But notice the Bechor Shor goes in that direction, which, again, complicates things further, because not only are Rachel and Leah sisters who, as he said, as the Bechor Shor said in Vayikra, have natural love for each other, and now you've created enmity, but perhaps they don't even have that natural love. Maybe they're already coming from enmity because they're coming from two different mothers. So this problem of polygamy in the household, and children with different wives, and the squabbling that goes on already goes one generation back, perhaps. The relationship between Rachel and Leah, and what happened, seems to be the explanation, I believe, for what we say in the Haggadah. Lavan bikesh lakor hakol. Meaning, and we're ascribing to Lavan something that maybe he didn't intend at the beginning, but we're doing it to set up the Bechol Orador, the notion that this attempt to destroy us is even predates Paro. And that is that Lavan, by negotiating, by wheedling, however he did it, to get Yaakov to marry two sisters, was a recipe for self-destruction. Important to note that in our understanding of the Haggadah, Lavan bikesh lakor hakol. But now, looking back at the story of Rachel and Leah both marrying Yaakov, and again, the approach that Rachel was in on it, and Rachel understood she was really the desired wife, but that she didn't want her sister to be embarrassed, etc., is again kind of challenged from this passage later on in this week's parasha. And the famous story of the dudaim, flowers, the mandrakes, that Reuven goes out. Reuven, the oldest child, goes out and picks these mandrakes, brings them to Leah. Are they aphrodisiacs? Are they fertility, believed to help fertility? He brings them to Leah. And now, Vayelech Reuven, source 15. We make tzirchitim by imsad dudaim basadeh, and the word dudaim is very likely related to dod, beloved. By Aveotam Eliyaim, he brings them to Leah, his mother. Tom Rachel Eliah, so Rachel kind of demands, because na in Tanakh means now, give me now some of your son's flowers. Now watch what Leah says. It's not enough you took my husband, now you're taking my son's flowers. Now, of course, it's a strange conversation, because taking a husband is a huge thing, and flowers we think of as insignificant. Maybe they didn't think they were so insignificant. But notice what Leah says. Is it not enough that you took my husband? Which means that Leah certainly thinks that she was the one promised to Yaakov, or the one supposed to marry Yaakov. And that then Rachel, by agreeing to come in as a second wife, has been carping in on this relationship and hurting the relationship. By the way, Rachel does not have an answer here. Rachel doesn't say, really, he's my husband. Really, you were done a favor here. She doesn't say that, which again supports the idea that neither one of them was aware of what was supposed to happen that night, and that Yaakov really expected it to be Rachel. In any case, what does Rachel answer back? All right, I'll negotiate and I'll give you my night with Yaakov in lieu of the flowers, and that's what happens. And that, of course, leads to Yisachar. Now, how does that all develop? So as we know, it develops very badly. Yosef, who is the child of Rachel, who is beloved by Yaakov, again, go back to the Parsha and Dvarim about Ben Ha'uva and Ben Asnua. And Yaakov favors him and makes him the cloak, and the brothers hate him. And it's kind of understandable why they hate him. I'm not trying to justify it, but it's understandable. Here's a boy who is favored. He's not the eldest, and he's favored because father loves his dear mother who passed away, giving birth to his little brother, and father can't stop mourning for her. And now he's showered all of his affection on this kid. In the meantime, the rest of us are schlepping, we're working, and we're not being favored. And notice the pasuk Dalet, Vayuroto ki achav, she'oto avav mikol achav vayisnuoto. Now, this vayisnuoto is not a question of less preferred. This is hatred. The brothers can't even speak peaceably to him because they hate him so much, because father favors him. And again, the issue of jealousy, the issue of favoritism, the issue of being the one not favored, always creates enmity, which is why two wives is a problem. And now what happens in the next generation? And watch Rav's famous statement here, putting the blame of the entire Shibud Mitzrayim at the feet of Yaakov and his parenting. Amar Rav Chama Bar Guri Amar Rav, never favor one kid over the others. Why? Because of that bit of material that Yaakov gave to Yosef, the cloak. His brothers got jealous of him. One thing led to the other. And we all ended up in Mitzrayim as slaves. And think about it. We all ended up in Mitzrayim only because Yosef got thrown in the pit and got sold. Whether the brothers sold him, whether they didn't get there in time, and the Midianim sold him, he got sold. He ended up as a slave, ended up as viceroy in Egypt. Now that he's in a position of power, when the family comes down to Egypt to get food, they naturally stay there because Yosef is in charge. And one thing turns, so from being part of the elite 1% of the society, as you see at the end of Vayigash, by the time we get to the beginning of Shemot, things have turned and they are enslaved as state slaves. So it all starts with Yosef getting sold, which all started because of favoring one son, which all started because of having two wives, which by definition, you're going to like one more than the other. And the child of the wife that you like more is not the Bechor, and you favor him nonetheless. And what would have happened had Yosef been the Bechor and Yaakov would have favored him more? Would it have been different? We don't know. This is the way things played out, and they played out very badly. And now we see This is sort of the recipe, if you will, for disunity. The recipe for disunity is creating a circumstance which is not thought out and which is going to lead, or perhaps you aren't given the choice in it, but a circumstance which is going to lead to hatred, a circumstance going to lead to jealousy, a circumstance in which somebody is going to not see his or her own commitment and portion as being a part of the whole where he has to contribute, but rather is being threatened by the other and has to set for himself his own place and to negate the other. And that's what happens in a situation. You could roll it back and say it all starts with Leah, with Lavan and what he did. Lavan became Shakor. Where do things change? Because things do change. So there was a picture that that I have in my head from a couple months ago already. It's a month and a half. I think we were all aware of the noble attempt that was successful in previous years to have a public tefillah in the streets of Tel Aviv on Yom Kippur for, I think, called and Nila. And the fact that this year, because of the attempt to have a rechitza put up and the Iriyah saying no, etc., it led to some machloket in the pictures that I'm sure most of us saw of the fighting going on in the streets on Yom Kippur between Jews about the rechitza, about the presence there, etc., was just really horrifying. Somebody juxtaposed a video of that with a video from less than 2 weeks later of some of the same people on both sides, as it were, and it's harsh to talk about sides, but it was, working together and packing boxes for Chayalim and for residents of the South who had been evacuated. It was a very powerful statement, very powerful picture, but it's something that's not new. When you take a look at the family structure, you see, for instance, here when the family is all settled in Hebron, that Yosef is hanging out with Bnei Bilhah and Bnei Zilpah. Who is he not hanging out with? He's not hanging out with Bnei Leah. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. We're not sure about Yisachar and Zebulun, but those four are on their own. They're the ones who go up to Shechem. They're the ones who are shepherding up there. Right? Likely it's Shimon, Levi, Reuven, Yehuda are explicitly there. And Yosef, who was he able to play with or to hang out with, is the ones who are considered to be lesser kids because their mothers are not full wives. They are Bnei Shfachot, Bnei Bilhah, Bnei Zilpah. When you take a look, again, during those relatively peaceful times, and this is a little bit earlier in the text, when the first genealogy of the family is presented, towards the end of Vayishlach, just before the genealogy of Esav that we saw, it records as follows: Bnei Leah, B'chor Yaakov, Reuven, Shimon, V'Levi, Yehuda, V'Yisachar, Zebulun. Uvnei Rachel, Yosef, Binyamin. Uvnei Bilhah, Shivchat Rachel, Naftan, Naphtali. V'Zilpah, Shivchat Leah, Gad, Be'asher. In perfect chiastic fashion, Leah, Rachel, Leah. But notice how they're divided. They're not reckoned by age order, certainly not by age order. They are not reckoned even by household, because Leah should then have the Zilpah kids with her, but rather by the status. Leah is separate, Rachel is separate, Bilhah is separate, and Zilpah is separate. However, when we get to near the beginning of Parshat Miketz, when the famine is set in, what happens? Vayirdu Achei Yosef Asara. The 10 sons of Yosef come down to Mitzrayim. Yosef, of course, not there, and Binyamin is too young to go, or father's favorite, and that hasn't been fixed yet. But the 10 of them go down together. And this very likely is what sparked Yosef's first interest when they saw them coming down, that the 10 of them are together, that separation that existed in the household has somehow been melted away. Why did they all come down together? It's a very simple answer. They were in trouble. They were in the famine. And as shepherds, that affected their livelihood, affected their flocks, affected their own food. They have children, grandchildren perhaps, and they got to take care of them. An interesting thing happens when the brothers come back the second time. Remember, they return to Egypt 3 times. The first time they come down, they return twice. They return the first time, this is Asara. Then they come back the next time with Binyamin, and then they have this meal we're going to look at in a minute. And then on the way out, they're caught, and they come back a third time, and that's where the famous standoff of Yehuda against Yosef is, and Yosef reveals himself, etc. In that middle time, when they come in, and Yosef releases Shimon and Binyamin is there. Yosef seats them at the table, and clearly it's not their intent, nor do they identify themselves as such, but by Yishvul Fanav, HaBechor ki Bechorato v'Atzir ki Tzirato. He seats them in age order, not by household, which means it's Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Yisar, Issachar, Zvulun, Binyamin. Now, maybe he hasn't coming around, so Binyamin's next to him, but nonetheless, they're surprised. They're kind of surprised. Now, the first obvious reason they'd be surprised, how does this wizard know what order we're born in? Perhaps they've also never even seen themselves that way. It's really not Binyamin there, as being simply a family of all the children of Yaakov. And the most natural order to sin is in by age, not because of what mother we come from, etc. And so it seems like this is the key to starting to fix things. Now, after that, when Yosef reveals himself, he has the family come down and look at the count of the family that comes down, how they're presented. There's a whole presentation of Bnei Leah. And afterwards, Bnei Zilpah, which means one rift has been healed, seemingly, which is the children of the Shfachot and the children of the Imahot are no longer considered to be separate. It's not like first class and second class. It's the house of Leah and the house of Rachel. Now, by this time, Leah and Rachel are both gone. But the house of Leah and the house of Rachel, Yaakov is still alive. And the same thing, Rachel and Bilhah are considered together. They come down to Egypt, remember, during difficult times. There's hope. They're looking forward to having a protection and everything else in Mitzrayim. But right now, things are tough. Watch what happens at the beginning of Shemot when they're counted again. When they're counted again, and this is from a perspective of Sefer Shemot, where they've already been in Mitzrayim for a while, they've had several generations born there, and they are among the elite. This is just before everything crashes. What happens? Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun, Binyamin, and separately, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. Separately, we have the Bnei Shfachot. We've shifted back to that two-class, kind of two-tiered system. Looking at all of this and the history of unity, disunity, however you want to describe this tiered system in the family, where there are the haves and the have-nots, or the have more and the have less, or the Yahuwah and the Snuah, it's clear that the challenge that we face is when things are good, when things are fine, and we suddenly think that we have room to disagree about things, to have one-upsmanship, etc. When things are tough, we all draw together, and that's how it should be. And this is not to argue that we should always be drawn together in the same way and never have any disagreements. Of course not. In a healthy society, you have disagreements, and you have ideals, and your ideals might not jive with the other person's ideals, and there are reasons to try to challenge each other and persuade each other, and even tell the shul you don't daven in. Not to defame it, but say, I prefer davening in that shul. I prefer davening in this nusach. Nothing wrong with that. But there's a far cry from that to the kind of disunity that we have seen described here of the actual hatred within the family. The challenges are something that we've seen documented in front of us over this court last hour. The challenges of unity. And the thing that ultimately brings us together is the challenge from the outside, the threat from the outside, where we see that ultimately we are one, and ultimately we need to take care of each other. And every one of those differences is relatively small compared to that which binds us together, and that which is the existential reality of who we are as Am Yisrael, one family. So I want to end by going back to the beginning of the shiur. I pointed out that in the Haggadah, we have this line near the beginning of the Haggadah, before the form of the Magid gets started. Baruch Shomer Avtachato Yisrael Baruch Hu, Shakadosh Baruch Hu Machashev Et HaKetz, Asot K'mon Shamar Lavon Avinu Ben Amtarim, or B'Brit Ben Amtarim, Shnemar, and we quote the Psukim. And as I said, the mainstream approach to understanding it as V'hisham dal avotenu or Hisham dal avotenu. The promise that stood for us is V'gam et hagoy asher yavodu dan anochi, that God will punish and judge the nation that enslaves us, will leave it great wealth, etc. That's what stood for us. The Netziv, sitting from his perch in Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th century, watching what was happening in Central Europe, in his commentary on Haggadah, had a different approach. The Netziv said, you know what's Hisham dal avotenu v'lanu? That wherever we go, we're going to be strangers. And we'll always have an awareness that the outside looks askance at us in good times, looks with enmity at us in worse times, and looks with savagery at us in the worst of times. He said that is the saving grace. That is Hisham dal avotenu v'lanu. Our awareness that we are always Am L'Vadad Yishkon. And that whatever respites we get, where there is a sense of a good feeling on the outside, there's every once in a while a poke to remind us of that. Of course, the big challenge for us, all of us, is to be able to take that wondrous, amazing, miraculous almost sense of unity and common purpose that we feel throughout the Jewish world. And we say the committed Jewish world. By committed, I say committed to Jewish people, no matter what the religious orientation, that the committed Jewish world has embraced fully during this period, and to take it and find a way in order to have that course through our dialogue, our disagreements, our state building, our community building from now on. So that we never again see images as we saw this past summer, and the images that we see of working together should not only be in response to war, but just in response to living. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu yashkin shalom be'artzenu, yilachem alamo v'al artzo, and should bring all of our chayalim and family back safely, and we should indeed see a full Yeshua soon. It was a pleasure studying with you, and let's indeed see Me'afilah Le'orah. Let's see days of great light and great love together. Israel.